is the author of 7 books for children and adults, as well as numerous magazine articles and blog posts. Originally raised in the Chicago area, she has now lived in Portland, Oregon for 17 years. She attended Brigham Young University, where she studied British literature, and Vermont College of Fine Arts, where she earned an MFA in creative writing. She has worked as a children's book editor and freelance author, and teaches poetry in K-12 schools. She has 2 children and currently teaches creative writing and composition at Portland Community College. She enjoys hiking and painting and building snowmen out of marshmallows, sometimes with her daughter.
Thank you for that introduction. I think pretty much my main claim to anything is that I can build marshmallows with my daughter. I'm really happy to be here tonight. Like you said, I moved to Hillsboro, specifically 17 years ago, from Chicago by route of some other places. But and there was just nothing like this in Hillsboro going on, I will tell you. So it's really, I saw the creative night that they're doing here, and it's great to see. And I know the Glenn and Viola Walter Arts Center here is doing some really fabulous things to bringing culture to our community, which is fabulous. So thanks very much for the opportunity to talk tonight. So sometimes people ask me, are you a children's book author, or are you an adult author, an adult book author? And that sounds slightly scandalous, but I think they make books for adults. So not anything else I could say. But for me, I don't really differentiate. Like when I'm writing something, I don't really care if it's for adults or kids. To me, all books are either well written or poorly written, and beyond that, I don't really care that much. So I'm not sure. I guess even before I had children, I owned a lot of kids' books, a lot of kids' books. So I just really enjoy children's literature, I guess. So the book that I brought tonight is Finding Fairies, and I don't care how old you are, fairies are just really fun and amazing and cool. And there are a lot of adults that don't have kids that do still own this book. I think my interest in fairies first began, I can't really remember, but much too young to really recall. There was just always a sense of mystery and magic to me about the natural world as a child, and so a lot of that found its expression in fairy tales that I would write and fairy lore that I would make up. So it was a pretty natural segue for me to write about fairies a little bit later on. Interestingly enough, I'm not the only one who is interested in fairies. It's quite a ubiquitous interest, as it turns out. And as I did really pretty extensive research for this book on fairies, I found that fairy lore and fairy myths and legends exist in every culture, which is really fascinating to me, especially because so much of what we hear about fairy lore tends to center on the Western world, specifically England, Germany, Europe. So, and they have great fairy lore. I'm not, I do have red hair, so I can't say anything about Irish fairy lore, right? I mean, it's fabulous, but there are so many other cultures that also have rich traditions around fairy lore that we don't hear nearly as often. For instance, did you know that the Ojibwa Native American tribe believed in a tiny winged creature that cruised around on this insect and batted kids to sleep, and that's what makes them fall asleep? Anybody know that? I certainly didn't know that before starting the research for this book. So what we really wanted to do with this book was to highlight some of the traditions that come from the other cultures that you don't hear about nearly as often. And so we showed fairy lore from all over the world, ranging from the jinns, or we know them as genies, typically in Arabia, to some of the traditional ones. This is an Irish cavalcade. But there's the little winged creature I was telling you about. And the book was illustrated by the fabulously talented David Hone, who is a local illustrator. You may be familiar with his work. So Yeah, so that's really how that book came about. And as far as my interest in writing, really, I'm not a very good writing teacher in that way, because I can't remember when I didn't write. My earliest stories I actually dictated to my parents, and I wrote them down. I know, that's really silly. And when I was 7, I have a journal where I wrote, when I grow up, I want to write stories. Like, that was just, I didn't have a backup career plan, unfortunately, so it was just what I was going to do. But I thought that I might read a little bit from the introduction to Finding Fairies, and then talk a little bit more about some of my other work. Okay, so this is the introduction. Since time began, humans have known about the fairies. In fact, every culture around the world has their own traditions for befriending them. People have discovered favorite fairy treats, songs, games, and hiding places. The fairies and the rituals used to attract them are as different and fascinating as the areas they come from the tiny winged fairies of South America to the huge and hideous jinn of Arabia. As fairy lovers ourselves, we have spent years traveling the world collecting stories and activities for this book. In Cairo, we listened to taxi drivers tell of magic lamps and flying carpets. We visited temples in the Yucatan jungle that were built by wise fairy kings. In Africa, we celebrated the friendship of nature sprites in song and dance. We are excited to share the secrets that we discovered with you. Now you can use these traditions to attract fairies from around the world. So what exactly is a fairy? There are many definitions, but in this book we focused on magical beings that love and protect nature. Also, we included only those fairies who are friendly to humans. It wouldn't be much fun to attract a nasty fairy after all. Although some fairies may come from far away, they have no problem with traveling. So don't worry if you want to attract a fairy from Asia. You're just as likely to find a Chinese house fairy sweeping the floor in Boston as you are in Beijing. In this book, you'll learn many ways to make different gifts for fairy friends. Leave the presents for them to find, but don't be surprised if the gifts are still around days later. Often fairies take only the essence of an object and leave the shell behind. It's simpler to carry that way and easier to explain to kids. It was easier for our ancestors to find fairies many years ago. Today, as humans take over their wild places, these nature guardians don't trust us like they used to. If you want to find fairies, you must be gentle with the earth to convince them that you care about their world. You must also be clever. Fairies are often appear in disguise. Look carefully. That cat, flower, bird, or butterfly could really be a fairy coming to greet you. However, the greatest fairy finding secret of all is to believe in them. Because of this, fairies appear most often to children whose imaginations are still open to possibility. Can you imagine what it would be like to float through the air inside a soap bubble, curl up for a nap on the petals of a daffodil, or discover a tiny friend living inside your favorite ring? If you can, the fairies will like you best of all. This book is just for you. So that's the introduction, and the other thing that was really fun about this book is that it has activities and recipes that are from the cultures and related to the fairies from the countries that they represent. And I've tried all the recipes and they're really good. My favorite is the Chinese cherry dumplings. They're delicious. So that's this book, and I'll just talk briefly about my other work. Someone, before the reading started, asked what my niche is, and I said I try and avoid having a niche whenever possible, which is maybe not the best marketing idea, I don't know, but I write whatever is speaking to me at the time. So I know this is about as opposite as you can get from a fairy book, but I do also have a historical fiction novel, and I have noticed that sometimes in Portland, bringing up religion in public is sort of like wearing a bikini in public, and that it just makes everybody feel a little awkward and no one knows where to look. So, so at the risk of doing that, it does involve religion. It was based on some research I did with one of my ancestors who joined the Mormon Church, and it seemed like that time period was so fascinating, and yet everything I could find that was written about it was either like very pro the Mormon Church or very anti the Mormon Church. And so I really wanted to kind of explore it and navigate it and deal with it. Like, there are really weird parts about it, and there are some kind of cool parts about it, and that's what I wanted to look at. And specifically that question of faith and what drives people to leave their country and everything they know, which so many people did in that Western migration. So it has to do with that. And right now I thought it was interesting, the theme tonight was journeys, because I realized that so many of my own, actually all of my own work, actually that may be the only thing that it has in common, is there were a great deal of journeys. As I mentioned, as the intro mentioned, in researching this book is all about a journey. And the book that I'm working on right now is about illegal immigration, specifically during the Guatemalan Civil War. So the people that fled by train, atop trains, on foot. So I've spent quite a bit of time in the highlands in Guatemala, and so it became really fascinating with that time. I think that maybe journeys is the only link between all of my work. But yeah, I'm really fascinated by the unknown, I suppose, and that's where the fairies come in for me. To me, I like to believe that there's still part of this world that is unexplored and untouched, where there could be magical beings that dwell. I will be sad the day this whole world, if it ever turns into a strip mall. I think we still need those wild spaces. So anyway, thank you so much for listening to me ramble on and for coming here tonight, and have a lovely evening.